Week 6. We are more than halfway done with the quarter. This is lecture number 6 for 194A. So today's class is a little bit unique because about half the time I've allocated for our Q&A at the end with Nikhil Vishwanathan. That's this last bullet point. And so we're going to have kind of an abridged class. I want to do logistics super quick, intents, which is a fundamental topic in Android. And then I want to talk about one new topic, which is activity lifecycle. So right now we're in week 6. That means that all of you are working right now on the Google My Maps assignment, which is the second project. There's one more project after this called Yelp Clone. And then at the very end, we have the industry panel, which is basically, you can kind of think about our Q&A that we're going to have with Nikhil Vishwanathan at the end of today's class. And we're going to have like 3 people of similar caliber to Nikhil, and we can have like a really fun discussion with them. So right now, all of you are thinking about the My Maps assignment. This is a really critical assignment because it'll give you practice with the recycler view concept. It'll show you how to integrate with Google Maps. And the other major topic it'll cover is how to deal with activities and intents, which are, again, really fundamental to Android. Okay, awesome. So last week, we were talking about intents. So I want to start off with a question. What is an intent? What is an intent in Android? So either feel free to just say it verbally or put it in the chat, whatever you're more comfortable with. I'd love to get a couple people to chime in. What is an intent on Android? An intent is an intention or a request to do something in the world of Android. And so oftentimes that means that you'll end up passing information back and forth between activities. An activity is the primary way that you display a UI to the user. And so when you want to pass information back and forth between different screens or different UIs in your application, you'll use an intent for that. There are 2 kinds of intents, right? We talked about this last week. An explicit intent means that we launch another activity within your application. So for example, if I had another activity, like by default, you have an activity called main activity, right? If I have another activity called activity name, then the way I would launch activity main is I would create a new intent like this. I'd pass in the activity name class, and I would say start activity with that intent. The other kind of intent is an implicit intent. And we actually won't do this very much in our class, but you should know what an implicit intent is. It's a request to perform an action based on a desired result. So for example, let me actually just fix this right now. This is the same. So for example, if I wanted to open up url.com in the browser, right? This is a browser intent, and I'm using the action view intent constant. And basically what that's saying is that I want the Android system to help me open up this url.com in the browser. And so when you say start activity browser intent, the Android system will look at the applications that are installed on the device, on the phone, and try and figure out which application can handle this intent. And so if you're familiar with Android, you probably have seen like the system dialog pop up saying, hey, there are multiple applications which handle this intent. Which one do you want? So for example, if I have Google Chrome installed, like Chrome mobile installed on my phone, I also have a default browser app on my phone. I could have 2, 3, 4 different applications, which all could open up a browser, right? And so the Android system will then show you which one do you want to open it up with. That's one example of an implicit intent. And then another few examples of implicit intent is starting a phone call, taking a picture, or opening the map. So the idea is that I don't want to build an entire phone application within my app. I don't want to build a camera within my application. I'd rather just delegate that work to an existing application on the phone. And that's why implicit intents are really powerful. And we talked last week about how you can go from activity A and you can actually send data from activity A to activity B. There's also one more way of doing this, which is you could have activity B, which is the child activity, return data to the parent. And so the way that works is you launch the intent, and then when activity B is returning or finishing itself, it will use an intent again to pass data back to activity A. And so that's actually what I want to do with you today. Do y'all remember? So like last week, let me show you what we had. So we built this up together last week, right? It was an implementation of the recycler view. And what I want to do now is I click on this icon that will lead to another activity. And when I fill out this form and hit save, I would like to be able to return back to the main activity and have another contact or another person in that list. So that's what I want to do with each of you today. And then EK is asking, when do we start intent via intent this at main activity versus just intent this? Okay, that's a good question. So the this keyword in Android refers to the class which that method or that line is inside. And so let me show you actually over here. So here's the code that we wrote last week. And so the meaning of this will change depending on where you write it. So for example, in the onCreate method right here, if I write this, I can command click on it, and it actually shows me, okay, this is referring to the main activity. And so when it's unambiguous what this is referring to, you can just use this because it'll refer to the main activity. But in certain cases, for example, if you have like a click listener or another anonymous class somewhere, then in that case, the this will refer to the class which is enclosing it and not the main activity. And so in that case, you have to write this dot at main activity and in order to resolve that, it'll be pointing to the class here. Let's talk about how we're going to go about building this new functionality. We're going to have main activity launch a new activity called add contact activity. I think I called it add person activity, but it doesn't really matter. And the purpose of this new activity is adding a new contact into that list. Right? And you can also do it in many other ways, right? You could also have an intent to take a picture, and that new activity should return to the parent activity the picture that was taken. So the key to doing this is you have to say you have to call this separate method called start activity for result instead of start activity. And in order to get the data from the child activity, you have to override one more method called on activity result. All right, so let me show you. I did some of the coding for us already. So let me do a quick refresh of what we've done. So right now we have a main activity, and we have a data class here called person. And a person consists of a string, which is the name of that person, and an age, which is an integer. And so the onCreate method, all it does is it will call this method called create contacts, and that will essentially create a dummy list of 100 contacts, right? And then the responsibility of onCreate is to set up the recycler view with the adapter and a linear layout manager. And that is how we are rendering this list of 100 items, right? And so I would encourage you, like, if you have any questions about the adapter, which is the core part of the recycler view, let me know, and I'm happy to help clear up any confusion here. But the three key methods here are onCreate view holder, which is expensive. That's what's creating a brand new view. We actually don't need this one. Get item count is to decide how many items are in the data set. And then onBind view holder is intended to take the data at a particular position and bind it into the view holder. And that's how we're able to show this list of people. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that right now because I want to spend time more on this part, right? If I click on the plus button in the menu, I navigate to this new activity. So let me show you that. All right, so what I've done to enable the menu is I'm overriding one function here called onCreate options menu. And I defined a resource file. I can show you that really quick. So here, there's a menu resource file, which has one menu item called MIAdd, menu item add. And that's what is giving us that functionality over here. If I hit the back button, we have a plus button up here, right? So when I hit the plus button, then this method is going to be triggered on options item selected. So I'm overriding that one as well. And I'm checking, is the item that was selected, which is a parameter here, is that equal to the menu icon add the ID of that? right? And if they're equal, that means that the user did indeed tap on that plus button. And here I'm creating a new intent. So I'm saying I want to go to the add person activity, and I'm saying start activity. And that is how we are able to navigate to this activity. And so what I have over here is I created a very basic layout here in add person activity. And it consists of an edit text for the name, an edit text for the age, and a save button. And what I'm doing here is I'm adding a click listener on the save button. And right now, this is what I want to do with all of you. I'm collecting the data about the person's name and age based on those two edit texts. And now I would like to create a new person and actually show it back into the main activity. So for example, I might say like John Smith, age 52, and hit save. And what I would want to happen when I do that is I would like John Smith to show up somewhere in this list. Does that make sense, what we're trying to do here? Cool. All right, so let's do it together. So maybe someone could just help me out with, does someone have a question?
Yeah, I have a very quick question. So going back to the main activity Kotlin file.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is just a very minor thing, but I'm wondering when return true gets gets executed on line 52. Is it after the intent, like you're done with the intent, like you're done with whatever you're doing on that like page, or does it just run to like return true and then like that whole function kind of like just finishes running and then it moves you to a different like activity? I'm just wondering kind of like the order.
Yeah, definitely. So on options, we're talking about line 52, right? This return true here. So this function on options item selected is triggered whenever any item, in order to, the best way to do that, in my opinion, is if you just add a log statement here. You could say like log on option item selected, and then you have to define a tag up here. Let me just quickly do that. And so now, like, I actually won't run it, but basically I want to just show you I love this question because this is such a common thing that developers, I'm always confused about as well, right? Whether you're new or experienced, when does something get triggered is such a common question and it's fundamental to understanding. And so what I'm showing you here is like basically a framework for how do you answer that question on your own. And typically the way you do that is add a log statement, run the code, and you can see when this log statement gets triggered. And you can also do the same thing. Like for example, right before we hit return true, you can say like created activity inside like that. And then you can kind of trace through in logcat when different things are getting called. So that's kind of how you can do this in general. To answer your particular question though, the on options item selected returns a Boolean. We can actually look at the reasoning why. So the Boolean returns false to allow normal menu processing to proceed and true to consume it. And so the reason why I'm returning true here is because we have consumed the click on the menu. So if we wanted to propagate that up to our parent classes, that's what this line is doing, then we would call return super. But because we know that, okay, we don't want to do anything else aside from start the activity here, that's why after we validate that we are tapping on the add button, then we return true here. And start activity is the line of code, which is actually going to launch the new add person activity, but it doesn't actually kill the main activity. And so the main activity is still running, but it's just not going to be shown to the user, which is why we have to actually halt execution of this method, return true here. Does that kind of make sense? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that question is great because, like, in general, one of the biggest barriers to understanding is like with Android code, there's so much things you have to override and so many kind of framework things you have to deal with. And the best way to understand that is like doing this kind of thing where you just add a log statement and you can actually we'll do that later in class as well. I wanted to highlight that for activity lifecycle, but this is another good example where it's super helpful to do that. Okay, so now we're in add person activity. We have the person's name here and age that we're collecting from the edit text. Can someone just help me out with the architecture? Like, how should I be approaching this problem? Right now, we have a list of 100 people in our list. What I'd like to have happen is once this add person activity finishes itself, I would like to have 101 people in the activity. And if I do it again, I add one more person, then I'd like to have 102 people in the list. So I like this idea of basically what I'm hearing you say is we're going to create a new person here, and we're going to pass that back to the main activity. The only thing that I want to do differently is I want to create a new contact and add that into this list rather than replacing anyone. Does that make sense to everyone? So I think the first thing we can do here is let's just create a new person, right? So the person, each entity that we're rendering is an example of a person class. This is a data class, which just means we're holding data. And there are two parts to a person, a name and an age. So the way I can create a new person is by calling the constructor of the data class. So there are two parameters, the name and the age. I'll say person name and person age. And now, in order to return data back to the parent activity, let me just remind everyone what we're doing. We're doing this, right? So in the add contact or add person screen, we're going to pass data back into the list. So the way you do that is you create another intent here. So I say val result is equal to intent. And I'll say result dot put extra. Let me add that. All right, so this put extra is a method on the intent. And if I hit Command P, then it shows me what does it expect, right? So there's actually a ton of different ways you could call this. The key, like the name is the first attribute. That is always a string. So the way you can think about this is it's a key value pair, and the key is always a string. So I'm just going to say person here. And the value will be the actual newly created person that we have. So I'm going to put that person variable, right? So that's this guy. And so now you'll notice that there's a red underline under put extra. And the reason is because we're not matching any of the possible method parameters here, right? So like a person is like a unique data structure that we've created. It's not one of the primitive types like a car, byte array, byte, Boolean, etc. And so the fix for this is actually really easy. It's the same thing as what we're doing in the My Math assignment. I'm just going to make this data class person serializable. Has anyone heard of this term called serializable before? The serializable is an interface in Java. And what that means is you can take this class and deconstruct it into its primitive component so that it can be broken down and constructed again. And that's what serializable means. And if you actually tap into the definition of it, it's an interface, but it's totally empty, which means that there's nothing to do. All we need to do is extend it, and we automatically get all the benefit of something being serializable. So now that we made the person class serializable, this error went away. And then we can say set data. Or, let's see, how does it, remember. Set result. Let me say activity. Wow, my Android Studio is super laggy. Result okay, come on. Oh. All right, so what we're doing here is we constructed the intent, right? We passed in the person. Set result means here's the result of the activity. We're about to finish ourselves, and we're saying, okay, everything worked out well. Pass in the result data, and then finish. So when we call finish, then we'll return control of our program back to main activity. And this is where we are now going to call one more method called onActivityResult. And so what we're going to do here is the data that we passed into add person activity is result, right? So like whatever we passed in here is what we're now getting back inside of the data intent. So one quick thing that we should do before we fill this out is right now, if you look at how I'm starting the activity, we're saying start activity. But in order to get data back from the child activity, there's something else that we need to call, which is start activity for result. And that is the indication to the Android system that I actually want to get data back from the thing that I'm launching. So when you do start activity for result, it takes in a second parameter, which is called a request code. And so usually I'll just define that as a constant. So I'm going to add it up here. I'll say private const val request code. And let's say like, you can kind of make it any arbitrary number. I'll just call mine like 89. Okay, so now that we have the request code, that's what this is. That's what is the first parameter of on activity result. So I'm going to check that the request code matches up. If request code is equal to request code and the result code is equal to result OK. Does this make sense to people? So the first thing we do in on activity result is just validate that everything went okay. So that means that the data we're getting back here is indeed the thing that we launched the request for. Request code is equal, and the result of the activity is okay. And this is coming from us putting result okay right here. And so now what we need to do is look inside of the data class and pull out that person. So I'm going to say data dot get extra, get serializable extra. And what do I put here for the parameter? Can anyone tell me? So this intent is a key value store, right? So what did we put inside of the intent in add person activity? So we put in the key as person here. And so in order to get that same thing out, we need to use person again. And so probably what I would do is I would actually define that as another constant. I would say like const val, key person, like that. And then I would reference key person here. And I'd also reference it over here, right? Just so that, if I change the constant, I don't have to do it in multiple places. Now I can only have it defined once up here. Does that make sense? Okay, so we have the get serializable extra. There's an error here, right? And it says that only safe or non-null asserted calls are allowed on nullable receiver type of intent. Can someone explain this error to me? I can hover over it again. Do you all see that? Only safe or non-null. Because someone explain, what does that mean? Yeah, that's beautiful. I love it. Did everyone hear that? So what EK is saying is that this data parameter, which is what we're trying to access to get serializable extra method on, is of type intent question mark. And intent question mark means that this is a nullable type. And so Kotlin has a higher standard for nullability checks compared to Java or other languages. And so I have a slide for this. So in Java, you could just say, string name equal null, and then try and access the length of name. And that would allow you to build fine, but it would actually crash at runtime. On the other hand, with Kotlin, you're not allowed to, at compile time, you'll get a build error if you try and access a property of something which might be null. So for example, here, you have name, which is a nullable string, and then you're trying to access name.length. That would be a compiler error. So that's exactly what EK is pointing out, right? So I'm going to go back to the code here. So data is a nullable type intent. So you can't call dot on this nullable type. So there are a couple ways to fix it. There was a question on Piazza that I liked about, I think it was a very similar question. The way I would handle it is that, right now in our program is pretty simple. There's only one possibility of how we might get on activity result back, right? The only way we'll get in this method is if we call add person activity and finish, right? And here we're guaranteed to have a non-null intent because we're creating it right here. But there's no way to guarantee that at compile time. And especially if our program grows in size or complexity, then we might have like 10 activities, and it's going to be really complicated to mandate that we have data passed in here. So you probably should have some sort of like error checking here. You could say like if data is not equal to null, then you could, do this, right? And now we don't have that error. But I think honestly, just for the sake of like going fast, but the easier way to do this, I'm going to say question mark here, which means I want to only call this property if data is non-null. I'm going to cast the result as a person. this is going to be a person, right? This is a newly constructed person that we added. So now the only thing left to do is we need to add this person into the contacts. The way to do that is I'm going to make this a member variable. I'm going to first refactor this and just call it like contacts list. Then I'm going to define it up here, contacts list, and this is going to be a mutable list of person, right? And the reason it's mutable is because I'm actually going to be modifying it over time, right? And so now there's a complaint here because create contacts returns a list of person. It should instead return a mutable list of person, right? So hopefully, did that go away? No, why are we still? Okay, so what's happening here is it says val cannot be reassigned. And what's happening here is I declared contacts list up here to be an empty list, and then I'm reassigning it to be create contacts. So the better way to do this is actually not to assign a value here, but instead just declare it as a mutable list of person. So does that make sense what I just did there? So a val cannot be reassigned. So then I made this into a contacts list, which is just declaring the type here. And there's a property in Kotlin called late init, which means I'm going to guarantee assign the value of this later on. Cool. All right, so now we have contacts list. What I can do here is I can say contacts list dot add, and I'm going to add this, let's say at position 5. I'm going to add in this new person that we have. And now that we've modified the underlying data set for the recycler view, there's one more thing we need to do in order to have it show up properly, which is we need to tell the recycler view that the data has changed. So I'm going to get a reference to the recycler view, which is called RV contacts. And I'll say notify data set changed. Or sorry, it's on the adapter actually. So on the adapter class, I need to call a method called notify data set changed. So I can't do that from down here because the adapter is a local variable. So let me actually grab a reference to that. And we're going to do the same thing, right? I want to change this into a property rather than a local variable. Late init var. I just went super fast, but what I did here is instead of locally declaring the contacts adapter, I'm saving the value of the adapter into a member variable so I can access it across the main activity, right? And then when we get the data back for the new person, I'm calling notify data set changed. Okay, let's try it. I hope this works. This is a really good question. And so, okay, in all the walkthrough videos that I put together, I actually never use a companion object just because I actually wanted to avoid talking about what it was. I probably shouldn't have done that here either. But basically, the idea of a companion object is that there's no such thing as static. There's no static keyword in Kotlin. And so a companion object is essentially the replacement for static. What that means is for every instance of a main activity, there can only ever be one of these. And so if you have a background in Java, whenever you do something like private static final, the replacement for that is going to be companion object, and you put in the request here. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, so yeah, like stylistically, I think this is actually a better way of doing it. If you look at professional Android developers, they're going to be using companion objects. You could just as easily have done this, which is what I do in the walkthrough videos, and that would be identical in terms of behavior. Okay, so we're almost done. Let me I don't know what happened, error while executing. Let me just try running this one more time. Let's see if this works. All right, so we're here. Let's add Onyi as the new person. Onyi, you're going to be like 73 years old today. Hit save. All right, so do you see what happened here? So we came back to the main activity. We took that newly constructed person object, and we inserted it at position number 5. And that's how we're seeing this new person here. Make sense? So the last thing I want to do before we move over to Nikhil and have a Q&A with him is just wrapping up the activity backstack. So when you have an activity in Android, you go to a new activity, there's a concept of an activity backstack, which is kind of like a stack of plates. So you have a new activity, and then if you navigate from activity number 2 to another activity called activity number 3, these activities are going to be removed in the order that they were pushed onto the backstack. So if you hit the back button, or if you exit activity 3, you're going to destroy activity 3 and then go back onto activity 2. So this is a kind of good concept to keep in your head as you think about navigation in the world of Android. Cool. Okay, any questions about the Android stuff before we move over to our Q&A?